A concept that's important to explore as far as our understanding of non-homeostatic appetite goes is this concept of reward sensitivity. And we're talking about reward sensitivity, we're talking about the reward pathway. The reward pathway in the brain is outlined in this image here, and it involves basically a very important neuromodulator called dopamine, which gets a lot of press these days. All these areas that are highlighted here, the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the frontal cortex as well. These are all areas where dopamine has a lot of influence. The pathway really starts with the dopamine releasing neurons of the VTA that then project to the nucleus accumbens, which is one of these hot spots, as it's sometimes known, of the reward pathway. And what we see is when there's differences in this, what's called Mesolimbic dopamine pathway or Mesolimbic reward pathway, we also see differences in how much a particular person is motivated to go out and seek a reward. Dopamine is very motivating. It's also connected to our motor system as well. So it actually moves us towards something. And I'm laughing because I can actually picture myself late at night, not actually physically hungry, but it's like my body sometimes moving me towards a particular reward. And especially when I was dealing with binge eating syndrome as well, that is something that was very common. I just felt like there was this drive that was like picking my whole body up and moving me towards a reward. Okay, so when I talk about reward sensitivity, certain people might be more conditioned to find certain foods and eating behaviors and drugs, which is separate from this, quite rewarding. And if they do find them more rewarding, they might seek out that reward more so. Okay, so as the quote says here, this Mesolimbic dopamine circuit combined with inputs from various cortico and limbic, think like emotional centers, and thalamic, think sensory center afferents, modulate rewarding and conditioning properties of feeding that can override homeostatic signals, right? So basically, our reward centers are getting information from other parts of the brain as well, including what's in our environment and what our brain is thinking as well. And it can help us be motivated or drive us to be motivated to go and seek out, to want a particular reward. Often in the past, dopamine was called like the pleasure. Neurotransmitter, and it's more accurately described as a neuromodulator, A, and B, that's a little simplistic. It's not untrue, it's just a little bit simplistic because dopamine might not actually cause us to like something, right? It might not actually give us pleasure, but it makes us seek out pleasurable things. So it's more of a motivated behavior related neuromodulator. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is present a number of different studies that don't just speak to dopamine, but to speak to differences in this reward processing and how those differences might impact propensity for obesity. Okay, so in the last unit, I talked about different constructs that can fit under this umbrella of uncontrolled eating, which you could also argue is non-homeostatic appetite. And one of those constructs that could fit under non-homeostatic appetite is something called food addiction. Now, food addiction is highly controversial. Not everyone agrees with that term. And I understand why, because the term addiction is quite a strong one. And whether you can use the same definitions that we use to describe drug addiction and use that for food addiction, that there's a lot of controversy mixed up in that. That said, there is something called the Yale Food Addiction Scale that asks a number of questions. I think it's 25 questions it asks that helps to see if a person has some of the behaviors that could potentially fit within what would be called addictive behavior. Okay, so regardless if food addiction is a thing, isn't a thing, it does give us insights into uncontrolled eating. There's a lot going on the slide, but what I really want you to take from this is that in a study of individuals that were rated to have food addiction, or at the very least, they had some behaviors that are associated with uncontrolled eating. In these individuals, when we did fMRIs in these 150 individuals that had a BMI over 25, we found alterations that were specifically more or less centered in reward regions. Okay, so in individuals with food addiction showed greater connectivity between reward regions and brainstem and central autonomic networks, and lower connectivity between emotional regulation, sensory motor, and default mode networks. Okay, so as the conclusion says there, our results support the hypothesis that altered connectivity in reward regions could increase the risk for addictive behaviors, addictive adjustive behaviors. And I'm smiling here because altered connectivity doesn't tell us what the connectivity looks like, but we do see there's some sort of difference between individuals, at least in this study, between individuals who have a BMI over 25 and who, were rated to have food addiction compared to those that did not have food addiction. So something's going on in the reward circuitry. That's basically what this slide suggests. Okay, so what makes part of this material hard to unpack as well is that it's hard to actually find good human studies on the reward network and obesity and ingestive behaviors. So I'm trying not to use too many mouse studies, but I think this is a good one to help us understand a little bit more about this reward pathway and actually what it does. So it's an interesting study. So these are hyperdopaminergic mutant mice, and what they basically do is they knock out the dopamine transporter to help make them hyperdopaminergic. And so we have hyperdopaminergic mice and wild type mice. And they get them to do this particular task where they're trying to get to a particular goal. And what they found is basically in this one, a higher amount on this scale relates to a quicker time to completion. Okay, so the hyperdopaminergic mice were more motivated to complete the task faster compared to that wild type. And I actually feel this concept is even more appropriately explained in this diagram here, because it actually shows that the hyperdopaminergic mice, they were actually less distracted. They were quite motivated. They didn't dilly-dally at all. They were incentivized to complete the task and reach the food reward even more quickly compared to the wild type mice. Okay, even after the same sort of pre-training as well. And why this study is particularly fascinating is that this study tried to look at the differences between incentivized action, or like wanting, right? Like, am I motivated to act? Do I really want it that I'm motivated to act, or the mouse is motivated to act, which kind of 1 and 2 show, and a difference with liking as well. So this is a really cool study because it shows us, again, remember I said before that dopamine is kind of the pleasure hormone, but it's more about like seeking pleasure than feeling pleasure. Well, the first 2 graphs in this show that they were more incentivized and quick to seek out that food reward. But what this third one shows, and this is kind of interesting, is that there was no actual difference, and actually a little bit of a less in the liking of that reward. So once they finally get to the treat at the end, the mice that were hyperdopaminergic didn't seem to like the treat any more than the mice that were wild type. Now, a great question that you might be asking yourself right now is, how the heck do you know if a mouse likes something or not? And it's pretty interesting. They put these like they have a glass floor basically on the little training box, experimental box, and with a camera, so they can see the mouse's orofacial features as they're consuming the chow. And they look for features that are actually similar to the expressions that children make, that babies make, I should say, when they're enjoying something, right? So when babies like something, they're like, you can tell it. They're like, there's that like enjoyment orofacial features, and then the adverse reactions, babies do kind of the same thing as mice, or mice do the same thing as babies, that they're like, right? They don't want it at all. So they actually found that compared to the wild type mice, the hyperdopaminergic mice, they didn't have an increased amount of liking. They wanted the reward more. They weren't distracted. They wanted the reward more. They weren't distracted by tasks and seeking out the reward. But when they got the reward, they didn't even like it. And to me, this reminds me of, well, drug-seeking behavior, and actually overeating as well, or binge eating as well, because a lot of times when people have that drug-seeking behavior, food-seeking behavior, they want it. And I used to deal with binge eating, so I know this feeling. Like, you want it, like you need it, you have to get it, and you'll kind of do anything to get the reward. But then when you're eating the food, it's not like it's necessarily enjoyable. But something's going on to make you want to get it so much more. It's really, really fascinating. And what this study shows is that might be related to dopamine. And often when we're talking about dopamine, we think in this case that we're talking about that mesolimbic reward pathway as well. Okay. And we do see some differences unsurprisingly, we did see some differences in both food intake and body weight in those hyperdopaminergic mice. They ate more and they had higher body weights as well. So I wanted to have a slide that emphasized this point that I just made about the difference between wanting and liking. And again, that dopamine, it might be more related to the wanting and the motivated behavior associated with food and other behaviors than actually the pleasure of getting that reward. Okay, so just you can read through this, but this just kind of goes over that wanting versus liking. We do believe dopamine is involved in liking too, but just not to as much of a degree as we used to think so. Okay, so that was a mouse study, but what about humans? Is there any evidence to suggest that changes in dopamine might be related to further incentive to eat? So this study is kind of one of the better ones to show this relationship. And this is in individuals with binge eating disorder. And basically can read the y-axis more or less as increasing levels of dopamine. I don't have my regular pen today, so I'm kind of writing with my finger there. And here we say scores on the binge eating scale. And we did find in this study of individuals with binge eating disorder that those with more pronounced binge eating, as far as how it was scored on that particular scale, showed higher dopamine release when food was presented. So again, it's hard to fully say causation here, and we wouldn't say causation, but there's something going on with higher levels of dopamine, perhaps, or I'm just actually going to say changes in dopamine, because it's not as simple as that. Something might be going on with changes in dopamine and increased motivational behavior to consume. Okay. But dopamine, it's really hard to tease that out, because it isn't always that dopamine goes up, we seek out food more, right? There's a lot more going on than that. So please do keep that in mind. Okay, but this shows that there is a relationship perhaps in humans as well, at least for binge eating disorder. So those last few studies suggest, because we know dopamine is the main neuromodulator involved in the mesolimbic reward pathway, and we believe that changes in that circuitry can increase the desire to seek out food, which might be enhanced perhaps in individuals with obesity, that desire to seek out food. I wanted to give another piece of evidence to suggest that there are these changes in reward circuitry, but we're going to look at it a different way. And what this study did is it involved 24 women that some had obesity and some were normal weight, and they showed them pictures of both high calorie foods, as it shows here, the high cal condition, or low calorie foods. And what they found is that in the control individuals, so without obesity, when they were showed pictures of low calorie foods, they had more activation in a particular area called the medial prefrontal cortex, whereas individuals with obesity, when they were showed pictures of high calorie foods, they showed higher activation in an area that we know to be associated with the reward pathway, the ventral tegmental area. Okay, the medial prefrontal cortex, that's more about cognitive control, something we'll get to a little bit later, but it's really B that stands out here. Okay, as far as the reward mechanism. C and D also show that compared to controls, there was higher activation both in the hippocampus, which is associated with our memory, and in an area called the insula, which is a area that we're still kind of trying to understand, but we do believe it's involved with part of the interpretation of some of the sensory cues. In part, does more than that, but some of the sensory cues. So really the standout thing that from this slide that relates to this reward differences that might be driving non-homeostatic appetite really is B here, right? We saw higher activation in the ventral tegmental area in individuals with obesity when they were shown pictures of high calorie foods, suggesting differences in reward circuitry. What exactly those differences are, there's more that we still have to learn in this area, but there's something different is the point. And again, this is the same kind of conditions that we talked about before, and these are all kind of comparing individuals with obesity to controls. Really, as far as our purposes, I wanted to focus on the fact that we had changes in activation in the insula. That's going to come up in the next unit. We had changes in the lateral orbital frontal cortex, which again is going to come up in the next unit. We saw changes in the amygdala, which we're not actually going to talk about that much, but that's often involved in like our fear and our stress responses as well. And F is kind of the big one as well. F is E blown up. We saw enhanced activation of the nucleus accumbens, which again is a key part of that reward pathway. Okay, so what are we trying to put together? What's the big message? There might be differences in reward sensitivity that promote a higher drive to consume in some individuals compared to others. And individuals with obesity might have that higher reward drive that is in part modulated by dopamine that leads someone to go out and seek food, to have motivated behavior to go out and seek food. But I think this caveat at the bottom by these authors is important, right? Although we observe clear and extensive differences between our obese and control samples, it is not possible to determine whether the observed effects represent causes or consequences of obesity. So we always have to remember association does not equal causation, and it's hard to know if is it that obesity is changing the brain, or changes in the brain are promoting obesity, or is it kind of bi-directional, that relationship? So hopefully this is starting to paint a picture that something's different in certain individuals associated with the reward pathway that's causing certain individuals to seek out food more than others. Now, just to kind of end this part of the module off, I wanted to add another layer to this around what kinds of things might be more rewarding compared to others. And again, I'm going to kind of go back to some mice studies before I go into a human study on this same thing. So one of the things that I don't think surprises anyone to say is that sweetness, and as we're going to see later, particularly sweetness with fat as well, seems to be particularly rewarding. So in this trial, mice were given the option between basically pushing a lever and getting cocaine intravenously, like they had an intravenous cocaine hooked up to them, or pushing a lever and getting saccharin, which is sweet but doesn't have calories. Okay, so they're eliminating the potential that the mouse is seeking out energy, right? It's just a sweetness thing, okay? So the mice were given the option between push the lever, get a shot of cocaine, or push a lever and get some sweetness. And what they found is that lever S, saccharin, okay, and lever C is cocaine, that over time, they developed a significant preference for the saccharin hit as opposed to the cocaine hit, okay? Arguing, as we see in this kind of third graph here, that when they have an equal choice between saccharin and cocaine, those mice would rather work harder, be motivated to consume saccharin, get some sweetness over getting cocaine. Okay, and these aren't hyperdopaminergic mice or anything. These are just wild type mice. Okay, but it again shows that there's something in potentially sweetness that is particularly rewarding, or get more excited about that reward more so than the reward of cocaine. I don't know, I've never done cocaine, but I've heard it's pretty damn rewarding. And this is actually part of the same study, and how to read this is basically anything above a 0 shows a preference in a particular direction. So if it's over 0 in this direction, it shows a preference for saccharin. And if it's below 0 in this section, it shows a preference for cocaine. And basically, when, again, mice have a choice, push a lever and get cocaine, or push a lever and get nothing, no fluid, they're going to go for the cocaine. If they have a choice between push a lever and get cocaine, or push a lever and get water, they went for the cocaine, okay? However, once they had the choice between pushing a lever and getting cocaine, or pushing a lever and going for saccharin, okay, which remember doesn't have calories, they preferred the sweetness hit. And when we change that to sucrose, so it wasn't just like a non-nutritive sweetener factor, it's a sweetness thing. When they changed that reward to sucrose, again, there was still this preference for sugar over cocaine, right? Which led to that conclusion, or the name of this study, called Intense Sweetness Surpasses Cocaine Reward, which was very editorialized in the media. Okay, but we always have to be careful because these are mice studies, they are not in humans, but it again suggests that certain things might be more rewarding than others, and even more rewarding, certain foods, especially sweet foods, we're going to see in a second, sweet and fat foods, might be even more. And so to add to that last study and to talk about humans, I turn now to a seminal 1983 paper that looked at the desirability of milk products related to their fat content versus their sugar content. And what they found was that as the sugar content of a food rose, so did the kind of rating of the desirability of that food, up until a particular point where that declined. And think about it, eating sugar, a little bit of sugar tastes good, but the more and more pure sugar that you were to consume, likely the less you're going to like it. You're not just going to, maybe you will, no judgments, but most people aren't just going to sit there and eat tablespoons of sugar. However, what they found actually was that the desirability of fat didn't decrease as much as the level of fat increased. Okay, so the desirability of fat didn't increase as much as the levels of fat in that product increase. But kind of putting all that together, they found this kind of magic zone where a certain amount of sugar content and a certain amount of fat content in a food was related to the highest desirability of that food, right? And the highest, I want to consume more of that food. And really, I just want to leave it at that concept that certain foods might be more naturally rewarding than others. Foods that are probably higher in sugar are likely going to be more rewarding, especially if they're combined with fat. I call them sugar fat bombs, right? Add salt in there too. That's a triple hit. It's delicious. Okay. Notice how many of our foods in our food environment are based on that concoction. High sugar, high fat, high salt. That is something that really feels very desirable to a lot of people, and might, for some people, feel more rewarding, and they're going to work harder to seek that out, especially perhaps if they have some of those changes in their reward pathway that makes them more susceptible to seek out those rewards. Okay? So I try to make sense of this evidence as much as I can. It's a huge evidence base, and I just wanted to pull some things out that help give us a picture of how reward circuitry can potentially impact our desire to seek out food. Maybe influences how much we like it, but kind of depends on the person perhaps as well. And that certain food combinations, especially foods that are higher in sugar and fat, might actually seem more desirable than others. And I don't think anything I just said is that surprising, but I wanted to add some of the evidence base for that.